Hello and thank you for joining us for another of our A to Z videos. I'm Sarah from Peak Physiotherapy. Today we're back at the bar for the letter R and we're going to talk about rondejambe. As many of you will know, rondejambe is an exercise that we do fairly early on in a ballet class as part of our warm-up, and as the French translation suggests, it's literally a circling movement of the leg, so it's great for warming up the legs and the hips. It can take various different formats, some of which we'll go through today, and there are just a few pointers that I want to mention to stop you getting injured whilst doing this at home. So we usually start rondejambe at the bar, and in its basic format we're drawing a capital letter D with our foot as we circle the leg, and the movement can go outwards like this, en dehors, or inwards, en dedans, which is the reverse movement. It can be broken into a demi-rondejambe or a half rondejambe, where we just do half of the movement in each direction, or it can be the full circle of the leg. It can be done on fondue, and it can be done en l'air at different heights. And there are other variations as well, which we won't go into today, but the step can move into the centre and be combined with other movements as we progress through our choreography. Now the exercise itself is pretty straightforward, however it does provide a challenge technically, as we need to think about both the supporting leg and the working leg throughout the movement in order to protect the joints and avoid injury. The principles are similar to those that we've mentioned in other videos, so do have a look back and revise those, but we'll talk through them again just as a reminder. If we start with the supporting leg, this foot needs to be nicely placed with the arch of the foot supported so that we're not rolling back and forth between the borders of the foot as the leg circles. This is particularly important when we go onto fondue to make sure that we don't swing and drop onto the arch, which puts a strain through the front of the ankle joint. Keep that foot supported at all times. The next thing to be careful of with the supporting side is not to swing off the hip as you're coming through second to the derriere position. And what I mean by this is that once you pass this second position, don't allow the leg to swing back so that you're straining at the front of the hip and also lower down into the knee and the ankle. Keep really strong through that supporting side. Use your core muscles to keep that position as the leg circles in whichever direction and at whatever speed. And just a final prompt for the supporting leg, make sure that you don't sit into that hip as the working leg is circling. Keep strong through your core, particularly into your turnout muscles, into your bottom, so that you don't sink under the bar and into that hip, which puts a lot of strain through the hip, the pelvis and the lower back. And this is particularly important for when the leg lifts en l'air and starts to circle. Make sure that you're strong through that supporting side at all times. So now let's take a look at the working leg. Now the main consideration here is control of our turnout throughout the movement. So if we look at the à terre rondejambe, so on the floors, this is easiest to control. Really think about keeping that heel forward and the leg rotating round from the turnout muscles in the buttock all the way through the movement. As we move from second to arabesque, try and keep that turnout so we don't anticipate the leg moving to the back, and this keeps a nice line all the way into that position. Bring the heel forward so that when we hit first, we're in a nice symmetrical position each time we pass through that point. And similarly going backwards, take the toes back, so again we hit that nice first position. Hit your arabesque line with a nice upright posture, and then think about hitting the second in turnout before we then come back through to the front. So as we progress through class and we start to work en l'air, those principles of turnout control at the working leg still apply. It's harder to maintain your control when the leg is working in elevation, and we do have other considerations such as pelvic tilt as we bring the leg into arabesque and then back to the devant position. But what I really want to talk about is protecting the hip as we start to work en l'air. It's important that you only work at the level of your own control and flexibility, and that's largely to stop overturning and overstraining the joint, particularly the capsule and the labrum. The hip joint is a ball and socket joint which has freedom of movement in many different directions, and the labrum is a layer of cartilage which essentially deepens the socket to give the joint a little bit more structure and stability. Now, as dancers, we push our hips in lots of extremes of movement, so it's unsurprising that I see many dancers through my clinic suffering with hip problems. The majority of these issues turn out to be soft tissue problems, and in the main settle down with some physio treatment and some appropriate self-management. They're usually caused by overturning, overstressing the joint, particularly in the developing dancer. But it's important to say that if you have any persistent hip pain or perhaps clicking or locking in the joint, that you do seek the advice of a qualified physio, as you may need some treatment to help this settle. One thing you can work on in the meantime is the flexibility around the hip joint, taking into account the hip flexors at the front and also into the extensors and the rotators into the back of the joint. You might want to do a program of stretches or perhaps use a spiky ball into any tight areas in the muscle, and that will help to sort of increase the flexibility in and around the joint. We can stretch nicely into the front of the thigh and the front of the hip through the quadriceps muscles in this position. Just simply hold this with your heel to your bottom. Make sure you don't stick your bottom out, keep your pelvis tucked under, which maintains the stretch through the front of the joint. To come into the hip flexors themselves, you can come into a modified lunge position. Again, keep the pelvis tucked under as you drop into a mini lunge, and you will feel this stretch into the deeper hip flexors at the front of the joint. A nice way to stretch the back of the joint, we've looked at this position on the floor in a lying position. However, you can also cross the leg into a figure 4 position and sit back into your heels. This creates a stretch through the back of the joint, and you can simply hold this. If you're more flexible, you can raise your leg onto a surface and then lean forward over that supporting leg, changing the angle slightly to adapt the stretch to different areas of the buttock muscle. I hope that's given you some pointers and a few things to think about when practicing your rond de jambe at home. Hopefully it will help you stay injury-free. If you found the content useful, please do feel free to like and share, and if you do want to get in touch, our contact details can be found on our website at peakphysiotherapy.com. Look forward to seeing you again soon.